Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, whenever you decide to look at this. Today we're going to be going over the AMH 2020 practice exam, not the one you'll actually be taking, but the one that we're using for review, which should be in your Canvas inbox. I'm Professor Kaserman, and this is your review for AMH 2020. Now, our first question in your review, make sure you have it up when you're reviewing this, is the United States and the British Empire entered World War II at roughly the same time. This is false. The second question is Japan saw the war as necessary due to their reliance on import of oil, scrap metal, and rubber from the United States, as well as other Western sources, and the militarist faction within the Japanese government considered the U.S. embargo a de facto act of war. This is true. The next question, following World War II, returning soldiers were hesitant to use promised benefits under the 1944 GI Bill of Rights, and there was a reduction in the number of Union veterans attending college after the war. This, too, is false. This is false. Next is despite some delays, the United States took forceful steps during World War II to admit Jewish refugees. An example of this is the admission of 900 German Jewish refugees from the SS St. Louis, admitted to the U.S. on an emergency basis. This is false. Another question is, one social effect of the war was the mass hiring of female labor to replace conscripted and mobilized men in business and industry, often in non-traditional roles during World War II. This is true. Another question, according to our text, the Cold War grew out of the failure to achieve a durable settlement among leaders from the big three allies, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, as they met in Yalta in Russia, Crimea, and Potsdam in occupied Germany to shape the post-war order. This is true. It is basically straight out of your book. Another question, Joseph Stalin appealed to the United States and Britain to assist in supervising free and fair elections in Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe following World War II, but was rebuffed by President Truman and Prime Minister Churchill. This is false. On 1 October 1949, Mao Zedong declared China a communist people's republic following the defeat and expulsion of nationalist Kuomintang forces from mainland China. This is true. Another question, the United States and Britain maintained their nuclear monopoly until 1953, when the Soviet Union detonated their first successful nuclear device. This is false. Another question, on February 22nd, 1946, less than a year after the end of the war, the charge d'affaires of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, George Kennan, sent a famously lengthy telegram, literally referred to as a long telegram, to the State Department denouncing the Soviet Union. True. According to our text, the practice of real estate redlining, where the racial ethnic composition of a neighborhood was one of the factors used to determine mortgage risk, was implemented on a national scale by the federal government through the policies of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the Veterans Administration, and the Federal Housing Administration. This is true. All pre-war New Deal federal programs dating from the Franklin Roosevelt administration were eliminated by 1952. This is false. After being discredited during the Great Depression, the United States increasingly turned against unfettered capitalism as the decade of the 1950s progressed. This is false. One of the radical changes in communications was the emergence of television as a major source of home entertainment between 1948 and 1960. This is true. Another question, according to our text, much of the margin for John Fitzgerald Kennedy's narrow victory over Richard M. Nixon during the 1960 presidential election was due to Kennedy's more photogenic appearance on television, particularly during the presidential debates. This is true. Another question, the civil rights movement sit-ins targeted segregation in northern states such as Ohio and Colorado. This is false. A major turning point in the trajectory of the United States with regard to civil rights legislation, domestic policy, and foreign relations was the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy by the Marxist radical Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas, Texas on 22 November 1963. This is true. One significant U.S. action in the chain of events leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis was the U.S. CIA leadership sponsorship of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of Castrite Cuba on 17th through 20th of April 1961. This is true. Another question, upon the assassination of President Kennedy, its Vice President, Richard M. Nixon, was inaugurated and implemented far-reaching Great Society social welfare legislation, oversaw the passage of several Civil Rights Acts, and introduced ground combat forces into Vietnam. This is false. That was his Vice President Lyndon Johnson, not Nixon. According to our text, the civil rights movement at the beginning of the 1970s was very different from the more integrationist model of the early 1960s due to the rise of the Black Power movement as well as the rise of more radical and retribution-based factions within the movement itself. This is true. Another question, the United States military was defeated in Vietnam and was forced to evacuate the country due to North Vietnamese successful Tet Offensive in January of 1968. This is false. The Woodstock Music Festival in New York and the Altamont Speedway concert in California, occurring within months of each other, were both peaceful events and demonstrated the ideals of the so-called hippie movement. This is false. Another question, one significant factor that soured many Americans on both the Great Society and evolving civil rights movement was a series of urban riots between 1965 and 1970. This is true. President Lyndon Baines Johnson won the 1968 Democratic nomination for re-election, but lost in the presidential election to Richard Milhouse Nixon. This is false. Lyndon Johnson withdrew from the race before the primary was complete. Another question, female activist Phyllis Schlafly, Beverly LaHaye, and Anita Bryant supported the proposed Equal Rights Amendment, as well as the gay rights laws and other socially progressive legislation opposed by conservative Christians. False. They were the conservative Christians. In the 1980 presidential election, Ronald Wilson Reagan defeated the incumbent James Earl Jimmy Carter and John Anderson to become the 40th President of the United States. This is true. Formed in 1985, the Democratic Leadership Council was a group of politicians and other thought leaders within the Democratic Party who advocated for Keynesian economic policies and the concerns of organized labor while distancing the party from political moderates in the business community. This is false. Another question, two foreign policy issues that dominated the 1980 presidential campaign were the 52 American hostages by Iran following the seizure of the U.S. Embassy Tehran and the Soviet Union's December 1979 invasion of Afghanistan. This is true. During the 1984 presidential election, President Ronald Reagan barely defeated the Democratic candidate Walter Mondale, with Reagan carrying only 28 states and only 50.2% of the popular vote, 272 electoral votes, to Mondale's performance of 22 states and 48.9% of the popular vote, 268 electoral votes. This is false. Another question, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 due to economic stagnation and uncontrolled military spending, thereby ending the Cold War publicly announced by Winston Churchill in his 1946 Fulton, Missouri speech. This is true. Francis Fukuyama, one of the premier historians of the late Cold War era, predicted that socialism would return as a major force and that free markets would soon fall into disrepute due to its inherent contradictions. This is false. The first Gulf War, 1990 to 91, was caused by the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein's invasion of Saudi Arabia. This is false. He actually invaded Kuwait. George Herbert Walker Bush won the popular vote but was defeated in the Electoral College by William Jefferson Bill Clinton in the 1992 presidential election. This is false. This was when Ross Perot served as a spoiler, and Bill Clinton, with 43% of the vote, was elected president, but Bush got less than that. He got like 36% of the vote. And on September 11th, 2001, the World Trade Center towers in New York City were destroyed by Islamic suicide attacks. This is true. Now we're going to get into the multiple choice. So if the question is approximate cause of the U.S. entry into the Second World War it would be the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941, as well as Japanese attacks on the Philippines and other U.S. positions in the Pacific. Another question, during World War II, a great impact of American society was all answers are correct, which includes massive military expansion and the induction of unprecedented numbers of men and women into the U.S. military, rearmament and the production of unimaginable amounts of war material, wartime food rationing of food, consumer goods, fuel oil, and numerous other goods. All those are correct. If the question is, during World War II, President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066 had the effect of, and the answers are removing nearly the entire ethnic Japanese population from the U.S. Pacific coast, internment of large numbers of enemy aliens, largely German, Italian, and Hungarian immigrants at interior camps far from urban centers, and the establishment of large internment camps operated by the U.S. Army to detain enemy aliens and others considered security risks in isolated areas far from the coasts and urban centers. And the last answer is all answers are correct. Pick all answers are correct, because all of those were impacts of the of Executive Order 9066. The code name for the first successful United States effort to develop nuclear weapons was the Manhattan Project. The three main, notice I say main Axis powers that the United States fought during the Second World War were Japan, Germany, and Italy. The Korean conflict was triggered by the military invasion on 25 June 1950 of the UN-recognized Republic of Korea, South, by the Communist People's Democratic Republic of Korea, or North Korea. Another question, the U.S., British, and French response to the road, waterway, and rail blockade of the city of Berlin in 1948 was the largest military airlift in history as measured by duration and aircraft sorties to successfully supply the western sectors of Berlin. Another question, according to our text, the exploits of Senator Joseph McCarthy were often used to symbolize the excesses of anti-communism, and the answer to that is, however, despite Senator McCarthy's political grandstanding and overreach, it's damaged the reputation of the anti-communist cause. There was a legitimate anti-communist threat to the United States and its allies, with Soviet efforts directed in opposition to U.S. interests diplomatically, military, and politically, and there were many Americans who did cooperate to commit espionage on behalf of the Soviet Union and other communist nations. Another question is, in 1950, the U.S. Security Council produced a 58-page top secret report proclaiming the threat of Soviet communism. In this new post-war world, the report argued, the United States could no longer retreat towards isolationism without encouraging the aggressive expansion of communism across the globe. The United States, the report said, had to mobilize to ensure the survival of civilization itself. This report, which influenced U.S. strategic policy until the fall of the Soviet Union, was known as NSC 68, or National Security Council Document 68. Another question is Harvard economist and public intellectual John Kenneth Galbraith's celebrated book, Blank, examined America's newfound post-World War II consumer economy and political culture, and this will be The Affluent Society. His book was The Affluent Society. Another question, one of the first major post-World War II Supreme Court decisions relating to the constitutionality of segregation was the Shelley versus Kramer decision, which declared that race-based real estate covenants both unconstitutional and legally unenforceable. A musical form that emerged in the mid-1950s and heavily influenced the emerging post-war youth culture was rock and roll. By the mid-1950s, much of the nation's advertising, especially for automobiles, household products, and appliances, was targeted towards female consumers. According to our authors, in the 1950s, much of the cultural change towards a more individualistic culture was influenced by, and it will be, all answers are correct, the expansion of evangelical Protestant Christianity among the newly prosperous middle classes, the emergence of suburban and exurban lifestyles, as well as libertarian authors such as Ayn Rand, which separated people from direct government and cultural oversight, and the reemergence of classical economic theories of the Austrian school in opposition to the prevailing Keynesian economic model. All of these are correct. Another question, in the 1960s, the Freedom Riders referred to, and the answer will be, civil rights activists who organized interstate bus rides following a Supreme Court decision outlawing segregation on public buses and trains, where an interracial group of Freedom Riders boarded buses in Washington, D.C. with the intention of sitting in integrated patterns on buses as they traveled through the Deep South. Another question, on the 2nd of August, 1964, the U.S. Navy destroyer USS Maddox came under fire in uncertain circumstances. As a result, the U.S. Congress passed the blank, which was used by justification by U.S. President Lyndon Johnson to deploy U.S. ground troops and forces to Vietnam following the 1964 presidential election. And this is the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. For your next question, many youths of the 1960s and early 70s were attracted to a lifestyle known as the blank. This new cultural movement included support for civil rights, minority rights, recreational drug use, sexual liberation, anti-war activism, and a general rejection of both capitalism and traditional values. And this will be called the counterculture. The answer is the counterculture. Another question is, one of the most dangerous nuclear confrontations between the USSR and the U.S. occurred in October of 1962 and is known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Next question is, according to our authors, a key work in launching the so-called second wave feminist movement of the 1960s and early 70s was Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique. According to our text, the main factor driving both radicalism and reaction during the second half of the 1960s and early 1970s was the Vietnam conflict. The next question is, one of the major driving forces of the 1960s and early 1970s that contributed to the peace movement, the emergence of the so-called generation gap, and the rise of the counterculture, and increasing radicalism in the young, and a general rejection of both capitalism and traditional values, was the ongoing Vietnam conflict. It's hard to overstate how much that impacted the baby boom generation. Next question is, one of the major drivers of ongoing opposition to the Vietnam conflict of the young, particularly college-aged men, was the military draft. The next question is, 1968 is considered the year in which the world seemed to be unraveling as many terrible events unfolded. Which of the following destabilizing factors did not occur in 1968? Of the ones listed, of course, the inauguration of President Richard Nixon as president actually occurred on 20th of January 1969, so that's the only one that didn't occur in 1968. Another question is, according to our text, despite the 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1965 Voting Rights Act, civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King were perturbed by the lack of blank resulting from the efforts of the civil rights movement. And this is economic justice and wealth distribution was the main thing that was triggering the ongoing strife within the civil rights movement. Now we come on to our next one. Right now, if you've lost your place on your practice exam, I'm on question 61. We are now 3/5 of the way done. Of course, I'm intentionally not using numbers and I'm not using letters because these may be different on the test you'll be taking, as this is not the actual exam you'll be taking. And so with the 61, during the 1980s, one of the most popular of the new cable-based television channels, founded in 1981, that helped to break the information entertainment domination of the big three broadcast networks, had maintained from the 1950s through 1980s, was music television, or MTV. One of the major issues that affected the gay male population and brought the so-called gay liberation movement of sexual permissiveness to a halt was the acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. During the 1981 elections, the coalition of libertarians, social conservatives, business advocates, hard money economists, and Cold War hawks combined to support party and candidate, and that would be Republican Ronald Reagan. One of the most controversial aspects of the so-called Reagan defense buildup was the Star Wars missile defense system. One of the most notable diplomatic accomplishments of the Reagan presidential administration was, of course, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF Treaty, because all the other occurred either before or after Reagan was actually president. Next question is, William Jefferson Bill Clinton was elected president in 1992 on the Democratic Party ticket by running as and this will be New Democrat. The North American Free Trade Agreement was submitted to and ratified by the U.S. Senate during the presidential administration of William J. Bill Clinton. Following the September 11, 2001 attacks, the United States invaded the country of blank within a matter of weeks, triggering the longest conflict in U.S. history. And this will be the invasion of Afghanistan. So, next question is with regards to the invasion of Iraq in the spring of 2003, the U.S. and Iraq had been in a state of conflict to include military attacks since the conclusion of the first Gulf War in 1991. And number 70 on this test, I'm not saying it's way on your test, but on this test, number 70 will be the last of the multiple choice, and the rest will be fill in the blank. So, Number 70 is one of the major factors that facilitated the electoral victory of Senator Barack Obama over Senator John McCain in the 2008 presidential election was, and that'll be the recession of 2008 triggered by a real estate market crash and resulting U.S. banking crisis. Now we're going to do the short answer questions. These are the fill in the blank. So on this test, they begin with question 71. I'm not sure where it falls on your current test. But for 71, during the Second World War, the United States supported the blank empire led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill in resisting and ultimately defeating the Axis powers. That'll be the British Empire. 72, President blank was the American head of state from March 1933 until his death on 12 April 1945. Notably, he is the only American elected to the presidency more than twice, having won 4 separate presidential elections. That would be President Franklin Roosevelt. Again, Franklin Roosevelt. On the 2nd of September 1945, the Empire of blank was the last of the major Axis powers to surrender, signing the instrument of surrender on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, and that'll be the Empire of Japan. Next is upon the death of Franklin Roosevelt, blank was sworn in as the 33rd President of the United States and represented the United States in the post-World War II Potsdam Conference and left office in 1953 during the Korean conflict. This president is notable. He's the only president to date who has ordered the use of nuclear weapons in combat, which resulted in nearly complete destruction of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that will be Harry Truman, Harry S. Truman, or just President Truman. Next will be one of the major foreign policy incidents that damaged the Truman administration was the fall of mainland blank to communist forces led by Mao Zedong, which resulted in the non-communist forces fleeing to the island of Taiwan. And this will be the fall of China, of mainland China. Another question is another foreign policy challenge to the Truman administration was a conflict on the Blank Peninsula, which was ultimately endorsed by the United Nations, resulted in over 33,000 U.S. casualties dead, and ended in a military stalemate. And that is the Korean Peninsula, or Korean Peninsula. Next question is, the former Supreme Allied Commander Europe during World War II ran for the presidency in 1952. Blank promised to end the Korean conflict. During his term, the United States, during a period of unprecedented, he led the United States during a period of unprecedented prosperity and left office in January of 1961. Despite his personal popularity, his vice president, Richard Milhouse Nixon, was defeated in the 1960 presidential election. And this would be Dwight Eisenhower or just Eisenhower. During the 1950s, a conflict rivalry between the Soviet Union and its allies and the United States and its allies was known as the arms race, which resulted in increased baseline military spending and the emergence of, in the words of President Eisenhower, a military-industrial conflict. Again, arms race. Imagine your two arms racing. Arms race. The next question is, Democratic Massachusetts Senator blank defeated Vice President Richard Nixon in the 1960 presidential election due to several factors, from his photogenic appearance in televised debates, his exploitation of a largely fictional missile gap, as well as suspicious vote counting in Cook County, Illinois. This president was popular for his youthful appearance and his exhortations for Americans to pay any price and bear any burden in the defense of liberty. Notable events in this term included the failed Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine who had early defected to the Soviet Union and a Castro sympathizer, assassinated him in Dallas, Texas, with an Italian surplus Carcano rifle on 22nd of November, 1963. And of course, that's John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK, or Kennedy, President Kennedy. The next question, President Kennedy faced several foreign policy challenges during his presidency. It included less than stellar performance at the Vienna Summit, construction of the Berlin Wall, and the escalating Vietnam conflict. His greatest challenges involved the Caribbean island of blank, which included a failed CIA-sponsored invasion and a missile crisis that nearly triggered a nuclear war, and that'll be Cuba. Again, the Caribbean island of Cuba. So next question will be, following the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy in November of 1963, Vice President blank, the former Democratic Senate Majority Leader from Texas, assumed the presidency. This president shepherded passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and a series of social welfare programs collectively known as the Great Society. However, despite his overwhelming victory in the 1964 presidential election against Republican candidate Barry Goldwater, his term was marked by urban unrest and rioting, social decay, high-profile murders and assassinations of political and civil rights figures, introduction of American ground combat troops into Vietnam, and escalation of the wars in Indochina. In 1968, he refused to run for a second presidential term and died in 1973, and that will be Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, or President Johnson. And then the next question will be, despite his desire to focus on domestic policy, social welfare, and civil rights, President Johnson's administration came to be defined by U.S. participation in the Vietnam conflict. Another question is, in the 1968 presidential election, a nation that seemed to be on the verge of chaos elected Republican presidential candidate blank, a former senator from California and vice president of Dwight David Eisenhower from 1953 until 1961. After losing the 1960 presidential election to John F. Kennedy and the 1964 California gubernatorial election, this candidate returned to win the presidency. Some of his notable accomplishments include the withdrawal of U.S. military forces from Vietnam and his visit to Communist China in 1972. After his overwhelming re-election in 1972, this president was forced from office due to the unfolding Watergate scandal. The president is the only one to date to resign from office, which he did effective 9 August 1974, and that will be Richard Nixon. Richard M. Nixon, Richard Milhouse Nixon, or President Nixon. Another question is, a major event that weakened President Nixon's domestic standing in late 1963 was blanked by the Arab oil-producing countries due to U.S. support of Israel in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which resulted in gas lines, gasoline shortages, and a spike in U.S. gasoline prices. And that will be the oil embargo. I say again, oil embargo. Another question, a former Michigan football star, World War II naval officer, and a House Minority Leader, blank, was inaugurated president in 1974 following the early resignation of Vice President Spiro Agnew and the August resignation of Richard Nixon. This president was unique in the modern era in that he became president despite never having won an election on a national level ticket. The distrust of the federal government in the wake of many scandals, the fall of the South Vietnam to a North Vietnamese invasion, the ongoing energy crisis, and a distrust of establishment politicians as a result of multiple scandals, all conspired to lead to his defeat in the 1976 presidential election, the former Georgia governor, James Earl Jimmy Carter. Sharing his last name with a popular automotive brand, he was compared to a car known as the Pinto that was also in disrepute during the time. And that would be President Ford, Gerald R. Ford, Gerald Ford, any combination thereof. Another question is, one domestic factor that inhibited President Ford's domestic popularity and triggered his electoral defeat in 1976 presidential election was a rise of economic and monetary blank, triggered by rising oil prices and a weakening U.S. dollar, and that'll be inflation, monetary inflation. Blank, a United States Naval Academy graduate and former governor from Plains, Georgia, was elected president of the United States in 1976 and inaugurated in 1977. After a very successful initial period, which included the 1978 Camp David Accords, this president was overwhelmed by interrelated domestic and foreign issues, such as the ongoing energy crisis and related second oil shock, the negotiated turnover of the U.S.-controlled Panama Canal to Panama while it was still governed by a military junta, economic inflation, the fall of the Shah of Iran and resulting Iran hostage crisis, Islamic extremism, and economic recession, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, ongoing U.S. military readiness issues, and an ineffective response to the Soviet and Cuban sponsorship of revolutionary movements and regimes in Latin America hostile to U.S. interests. This U.S. president was defeated in the 1980 election and served only one term. And that is Jimmy Carter, James Earl Carter, James Earl Jimmy Carter, or President Carter. The next one will be, after winning the presidential election in 1980, blank, a Republican former actor, union president, and corporate spokesman for General Electric Company, assumed the presidency in 1980. Despite being the oldest president in the modern era, he survived an assassination attempt by John Hinckley and went on to oversee the largest reorganization of the Department of Defense since its inception, a rebuilding of military forces, a severe induced recession to bring inflation under control, tax reform, and a major reduction of government regulations adversely impacting private business. This president was reelected in a 49-state sweep out of 50 and concentrated on developing futuristic weapon systems, negotiating treaties limiting or abolishing entire classes of nuclear delivery systems, and defeating communist regimes through a combination of economic pressure and military threat. This president's term was so successful that his vice president became the first sitting VP to win in a presidential election since Martin Van Buren in 1936. And that, of course, will be Ronald Reagan, Ronald Wilson Reagan, President Reagan, R-E-A-G-A-N. Now we're down to the final 10 of the regular questions. So starting with on this test with 90, one of President Reagan's major domestic accomplishments was the taming of America's chronic economic inflation rate in association with the Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker through intentionally raising interest rates and triggering an economic recession in 1982, which hurt Republican presidential candidates in the midterm elections, but conversely set the stage for over 7 years of economic expansion. And that, of course, will be inflation, economic inflation rate. So next will be blank, a scion of New England WASP aristocracy, the grandson of an Ohio senator and son of a prominent Connecticut businessman, was one of the youngest commissioned naval aviators in history and served as a TBF Avenger torpedo pilot in World War II, surviving being shot down in the Pacific. Following the war, he became an oil company president and rumored clandestine CIA agent. Entering politics in the 1960s, he was President Ronald Wilson Reagan's vice president from 1981 to 1989. Elected to the presidency in 1988, he presided over the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the end of 75% of all Marxist communist governments worldwide by the conclusion of his term. During his term, the U.S. military forces invaded Panama to remove a military regime in power since 1964 and were deployed to protect Saudi Arabia and expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait in early 1991 following Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. Desert Storm was considered the most overwhelming U.S. victory since the end of World War II. Despite his overwhelming foreign policy success, this president was criticized for being out of touch with younger voters, was held responsible for a minor economic recession in 1991 and early 1992, and was criticized for many saw lackluster federal response to Hurricane Andrew in early fall of 1992. Further, as a member of the World War II generation, he was victim of an ongoing cultural chasm with members of the post-war baby boom generation, as well as the third-party candidate of H. Ross Perot, who opposed the pending NAFTA treaty with Canada and Mexico. The former governor of Arkansas defeated him in the 1992 presidential election. This is George H.W. Bush. Again, George Bush, H.W. Bush, George Bush 1, Senior Bush, President Bush 1, something so I know differentiate between George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. So the next question would be, President George H.W. Bush's re-election effort was hindered by the entry of Texas businessman H. Ross Perot, who opposed the blank treaty into the 1992 presidential race. Perot claimed this treaty would result in a giant sucking sound of American jobs being outsourced to Mexican factories. This treaty would ultimately be passed during the subsequent Clinton administration, and that's a NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. So another question would be, upon winning the 1992 presidential election, blank assumed office and immediately proceeded to change the perception of the presidency by incorporating popular and celebrity culture. During his election, he was interviewed on MTV and played the saxophone on the Arsenio Hall show. Following his election, in the first 2 years of his administration, this president attempted to pass universal health care to permit gays to serve openly in the military. Internationally, this president presided over passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico. In addition, in late 1992, the catastrophic military fiasco at Mogadishu, Somalia, on a UN mission occurred, as well as Islamic terror bombings of U.S. forces at the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia. Following the near-total electoral defeat of the Democratic Party in the 1994 midterms, which served as a rebuke to his policies to date, this president shifted policies, declaring that the era of big government was over and proceeding to triangulate his policies between the Republican majority in Congress and the stated positions of the Democratic Party, essentially to govern as a fiscal conservative and social liberal. Despite his success in co-opting several popular Republican initiatives and claiming credit for them and developing a reputation for being tough on crime, he was dogged by accusations of unrestrained use of force, such as during the Waco standoff, in which cult-like religious groups, which resulted in over 80 deaths of both cult members and federal agents. This president was also dogged by his sexual and personal proclivities, one of which, the Monica Lewinsky incident, resulted in the first impeachment trial of the sitting president for lying under oath in obstruction of justice since the impeachment of Andrew Johnson during the post-Civil War Reconstruction era. Buoyed by a strong economy facilitated by the rise of the Internet, this president oversaw the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe, the deployment of U.S. peacekeepers to end the Balkan conflict, the bombing in support of Kosovo independence, and several operations against Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq, the largest of which in Desert Fox in 1998 led to the establishment of a U.S. policy of regime change in Iraq. Despite his flaws, this president was extremely popular, both domestically and internationally. when he left office in 2001, which he parlayed into a very lucrative foundation and global initiative. His wife, Hillary, would run for president in 2016, and that is William Jefferson Clinton, William J. Clinton, Bill Clinton, or President Clinton. Any of those will work. Another question is, one controversial aspect of Bill Clinton's candidacy during the 1992 election was when evidence emerged that he accepted an Army ROT scholarship while a student at Yale while not intending to serve in the military in order to avoid conscription during the Vietnam conflict. I say again, Vietnam conflict. The next question is, this President blank, a popular and successful Republican governor of Texas, the son of a former president, and the brother of a popular and successful governor of Florida, when running against Vice President Al Gore, he lost the popular vote, was ultimately elected in the Electoral College after a long, drawn-out controversy settled in the Supreme Court, which involved the state of Florida and punch card machines, bringing the term hanging chad into popular use. Despite campaigning on a domestic focus, his first term was dominated by international events and terrorism, beginning with an air-to-air collision involving U.S. and Chinese military aircraft. On September 11, 2001, the entire trajectory of his presidency changed due to his Islamic terrorist attack on the New York World Trade Center and the Pentagon, resulting in over 3,000 deaths. Ultimately, U.S. forces successfully invaded both Afghanistan and Iraq. Re-elected in 2004, this president was criticized for both the inability to establish a consensus government to end the ongoing insurgency in Iraq, as well as the federal government's response to Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana. After his party lost control of both houses of Congress in 2006, this president fired his defense secretary and implemented the Iraqi surge offensive, which temporarily broke the back of the Islamic insurgency. When he left office in 2009, he was the most unpopular president upon leaving office since either Richard Nixon or Harry Truman, depending on the poll consulted. And that's George W. Bush. George Bush II, President George Bush II, or Jr. Any of those will work. Just let me know that it's President Bush and it's the son, not the father. Another question is, one criticism of civil libertarians have of the presidency of George W. Bush was the passage of the Blank Act in the aftermath of the September 2011 terrorist attacks, and that would be the Patriot Act. Again, the Patriot Act in the aftermath of the 2001 terrorist attacks. And so the next question, this President blank was the nation's first biracial president and won the Democratic nomination, was elected president on a platform of change in 2008. This president was elected in the aftermath of the 2008 economic recession, triggered by runaway real estate speculation driven by loose home mortgage policies mandated by the federal housing policies and the bundling and securitization of home mortgages by federally insured banks, which triggered a partial collapse of the U.S. banking industry. As a candidate, this president promised to withdraw all U.S. military forces from Iraq and benefited from American war weariness, as the Afghan conflict was in its 7th year and the Iraq conflict was entering its 5th year. After defeating fellow Senator John McCain, a war hero and former POW, this former Illinois senator and Chicago community organizer promised to fundamentally transform the United States. Among his accomplishments were the somewhat misnamed Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. Internationally, this president made numerous foreign visits, in which he boldly proclaimed changes to U.S. policy to foreign audiences to make U.S. foreign policies more palatable to U.S. citizens. This president also kept his campaign promise to pull U.S. forces out of Iraq. However, this resulted in the return of Sunni Islamic extremist forces, this time under the banner of the Islamic Front known as ISIS, ISIL, or Daesh. In addition, This president pursued both domestic and foreign policies that many Americans saw as divisive. After his policy losing control of the Congress in 2010, he increasingly governed by pen and phone administrative actions and executive orders. Though he remained personally popular, many of his policies became increasingly unpopular. Easily elected in 2012 over the Republican candidate, former Massachusetts Governor Willard Mitt Romney. His core foreign policies of rapprochements with regional rivals to U.S. interests such as China and Russia, as well as traditional U.S. adversaries such as Iran and Cuba, though initially popular, failed to match the initial optimism such policies generated with sustained improvements in relations. Despite his personal popularity, his chosen successor in the 2016 presidential election, former First Lady, Secretary of State, and New York Senator Hillary Clinton, was defeated by the Republican presidential candidate in the 2016 presidential election. Of course, this is Barack Obama. Barack Hussein Obama, Barack Obama, President Obama, any of those will work in this. One common criticism of the presidential administration of Barack Obama was the plethora of executive blank his administration generated due to his administration's inability to work with the Republican Party majority in Congress to pass legislation. And this is executive orders. Orders. The next to last question is, this president elected in 2016 is unique among presidents in the modern era that he held no previous elective office, had no previous military experience, no previous judicial experience, held no appointed governmental positions prior to his election to the American presidency in 2016, having previously engaged in property development, hotel management, luxury resorts, professional wrestling, and reality television. Prior to the presidency, he was famous or infamous as an outsized personality in both New York and Florida since the late 1970s. In 2016, he defeated a field of 16 above-average candidates for the Republican presidential nomination and defeated former First Lady, Secretary of State, New York Senator Hillary Clinton, who was selected by Barack H. Obama, the incumbent president, to succeed him in the 2006 presidential election. Opposed nearly universally by the Democratic Party, almost to the point of absurdity, almost the entire U.S. media, a large portion of the federal judiciary, numerous state governments, and a significant minority of the Republican Party, he lost the popular presidential vote but convincingly won the Electoral College. Winning in some states had not been carried by a presidential candidate in over a quarter century. Despite a combative, outsized, and loud personality and an almost pathological capability for exaggeration, this president displayed a nearly uncanny ability to force political and administrative opponents of his policies in unpopular positions and transparent obstruction. This ability to box his opposition into unreasonable positions, as well as forcing them to concentrate on matters of form over substance, allowed him to cater to his base and woo those who were mildly opposed to his personality and or policies by painting his opponents as short-sighted, extreme, and unreasonable. Perhaps no U.S. president in recent history has faced a wider amount of opposition as has President Donald J. Trump, Donald John Trump, or President Trump, to include investigations of accusations of ties to foreign power, questionable business dealings, sketchy personal relationships, and mixed opinions about women. The last question for credit is going to be one concern for civil libertarians during the current administration is the outsized role of intelligence agencies, judiciary, and the federal bureaucracy have assumed in opposing the policies of the Trump administration through ethically and legally dubious means. This group of relatively stable, unelected permanent officials is often derisively known as the blank, the deep state. Again, this was written in 2000, so things have changed since then. But then things are going back to being the same. So it'll be interesting how my next exam looks. So for your bonus questions, which are extra credit and not just basically for credit, these are extra credit to bring your grade up. So bonus question number 1 is the first using of nuclear, that's fission type weapons, was a bombing of the Japanese city of, and this is Hiroshima. Hiroshima, on 6th of August, 1945. And the next bonus question is the second wartime use of nuclear weapons was a bombing of the Japanese city of Nagasaki on the 9th of August, 1945. This bomb contained a different detonation system than the previous bomb, as well as using plutonium, like the planet Pluto. And Pluto will always be a planet to me. Plutonium, I spell Plutoinium, plutonium. Good stuff. So another question is the long-range heavy bomber developed by the United States that delivered the atomic bomb was the B blank, which actually cost more to develop than the Manhattan Project atomic weapons program. And that would be the B-29. I say 29. B-29. One foreign policy issue that saw the issue of the Cold War turn hot was the Soviet-sponsored attack in blank on 25 June 1950, which resulted in U.S. troops being deployed to fight a conflict in Asia. And that'll be in Korea, Korea, Korea. And the last bonus question, the total for the test is 100. You can get 105 points. 52 American hostages were seized by student radicals on 4 November 1979 at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Iran, which triggered the Iran hostage crisis. I say again, Iran, I-R-A-N. Don't get it mixed up with Iraq. That does happen. So this is your review. You know how to contact me if you have any questions or are not clear on some of these. And remember, this is not the actual test you'll be taking. This is an older exam that I've dedicated for the use of practice and review on your part, so use it wisely. Again, a disclaimer, I intentionally did not say what number I was on, except as a few times for a placeholder. That is because these questions tend to move around, answers tend to move around, and be careful because there may be some linguistic changes in the questions that change the nature of the answer. So use care and caution when taking this test, but if you study this and not just know the answers, but understand why the answers are what they are, you will probably get a 90% or better on the final exam. So with this, good luck, God bless, and I look forward to having a bunch of A questions on this test. Have a great day, and happy Thanksgiving, and I will see you later.